Madame Restell, Abortion, Secrecy, and the Making of a Public Enemy. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Author's note. Sources, method, and the discipline of what can be shown. This book was written to be read as true crime and to hold up as history. Those goals can coexist, but only if the narrative is built on a clear rule. No scene, claim, or conclusion is allowed to outrun the record. Madame Restell's story is unusually well known for a clandestine subject precisely because she was repeatedly pulled into public documentation, advertisements, prosecutions, press coverage, and later scholarship. That visibility creates an illusion of total knowledge. It is an illusion the historian must resist. What follows explains how the evidence was handled, what kinds of sources were prioritized, and what this book refuses to do. 1. Primary record first, always. Wherever possible, this account privileges contemporaneous sources. 19th century print material directly tied to legal proceedings, including the 1841 trial pamphlet associated with the Purdy case. Contemporaneous newspaper reporting, used cautiously, for what it reveals about public framing as much as for factual detail. Statutes and enforcement frameworks, notably the Comstock Act, and the postal obscenity enforcement regime that followed. Primary sources are not treated here as neutral truth. They are treated as dated artifacts produced inside institutions, courts, newspapers, moral reform organizations, with their own motives and constraints. 2. Secondary scholarship as scaffolding, not script. Modern scholarship is used to establish widely accepted chronology, especially around the 1878 arrest and death. Interpret institutional change, how policing shifted from private acts to public channels. Contextualize Restell within broader patterns of 19th century reproductive governance. Secondary sources are not used to fill gaps with certainty. When scholarship presents interpretation, it is labeled as interpretation. 3. Euphemism is treated as evidence, not decoration. Restell's world function through coded language, female complaints, monthly regulation, married ladies, strict privacy. This book treats euphemism as a historical mechanism, an operating system that enabled commerce, protected clients, and constrained what courts could prove. Euphemism also shaped the archive. It determines what the record can show and what it can only imply. This is why the narrative often emphasizes structures, advertising, enforcement, professionalization, over invented scenes of private action. For no invented recipe, no pretend chemistry. Many modern retellings claim precise formulas for 19th century female pills, or treat alleged ingredients as established fact. This book does not. The historical record is often insufficient to specify exact compositions reliably, and hostile sources frequently exaggerate or moralize. Where claims about substances appear, they are treated as claims made by contemporaries, not as laboratory-confirmed truth. This restraint is also a safety measure. It prevents the book from drifting into instructional territory. The aim here is history, not replication. 5. Insider scenes are avoided unless documented. Readers often want to know what happened in private rooms, exact conversations, precise procedures, interior motives. Those scenes are where popular true crime tends to invent. This book refuses that move. Unless a detail appears in a traceable contemporaneous record, testimony, sworn statement, or similarly attributable document, it is not staged as a scene. When the record is silent, the narrative stays silent. The result is a style of suspense that is documentary rather than cinematic, tension generated by what can be shown, not by what can be imagined. 6. Motive is treated as plural and limited. Restell's motives are not presented as a single moral story. The archive supports several realities at once. She built a profitable enterprise in a sustained market. She operated amid intense moral scrutiny and periodic prosecution. She became a symbolic target as enforcement strategies evolved. The book does not pretend to recover a single interior truth about her. It follows what the record can responsibly sustain. 7. The clients are treated as the center, even when the archive won't name them. The biggest ethical problem in writing reproductive history is that the archive preserves providers and prosecutors far more clearly than it preserves women seeking help. This book treats that absence as historically meaningful rather than as a gap to be filled with invention. It does not fabricate composite clients or imagined diaries. It points to the structural truth: a market of this kind persists because the need is real, and secrecy is the cost of survival. 8. Why this story is told at all. Madame Restell matters not because she was the only provider, but because she is one of the few whose life was made repeatedly visible, through advertising, law, and press. That visibility lets us see the mechanics of 19th century control, how a society polices women's bodies through institutions, and how it uses a named woman to carry blame for a system it quietly relies upon. The reader is invited to hold two ideas at once. The record is incomplete, and must not be forced into false certainty. The record is still sufficient to show patterns of power, secrecy, and enforcement. That is the method of this book: evidence first, interpretation clearly labeled, and silence where silence is the only honest choice. Preface. In the 19th century, most abortion providers vanished into the record the way their work was designed to vanish, without names, without paperwork, without a public face. They appear fleetingly as midwives, handywomen, or unknown females, surfacing only when something went wrong or when authorities decided to make an example. Their stories survive as fragments: indictments without biography, rumors without context, outcomes without interior life. Madame Restell did not vanish. She advertised. She branded. She endured. And because she did all three, she became one of the most relentlessly documented women in American reproductive history: pursued, prosecuted, denounced, and repeatedly returned to public view over nearly 4 decades. Her notoriety was not accidental. It was structural. This book begins with that refusal to disappear. Antro Lohman, known to the public as Madame Restell, lived and worked at the hinge of several 19th century transformations: the criminalization of abortion, the professionalization of medicine, the rise of mass advertising, and the emergence of moral reform movements that treated women's bodies as a public battleground. She did not invent abortion provision, nor was she the most medically skilled or clandestine practitioner of her era. What distinguished her was visibility, chosen, sustained, and ultimately weaponized against her. Visibility is not the same thing as confession. Restell's advertisements spoke in euphemism. Her services were framed as female relief, monthly regulation, and discretion. The language was both protective and provocative. It allowed women to find her without forcing her to state plainly what could not yet be spoken safely in print. It also allowed reformers to argue that everyone knew exactly what she meant. This double legibility, clear enough to attract clients, deniable enough to frustrate prosecution, defined her career. It also defined the state's obsession with her. From the 1840s onward, Restell became a recurring character in New York's moral imagination. She was arrested, tried, fined, and released. She adapted. Laws shifted, she shifted with them. Medical authority hardened, she continued to operate in the gaps between professional jurisdiction and women's private need. Each encounter with the legal system sharpened her public profile rather than extinguishing it. That persistence unsettled the people who wanted her gone. This book is not a moral defense of Madame Restell, nor is it a crusade against her. It does not ask the reader to decide whether she was heroine or villain, pioneer or predator. Those categories flatten more than they explain. Instead, this book asks a different set of questions. Why did she become so visible when others did not? What work did her notoriety perform for the state, for reformers, and for the emerging medical profession? And what does her long pursuit reveal about how societies manage reproductive control when private demand collides with public anxiety? Restell's story is often told backward, beginning with her death in 1878. Arrested under federal obscenity statutes by Anthony Comstock, she died by suicide before trial, her throat cut in the bathtub of a Fifth Avenue mansion. The image is irresistible to storytellers, a fallen queen of vice brought low by moral law. But that ending obscures the longer, more instructive arc that precedes it. For nearly 40 years before that moment, Restell lived in the open. She owned property. She accumulated wealth. She appeared in courtrooms not as a trembling defendant, but as a seasoned operator who understood the limits of what could be proven. She survived an era in which abortion law was unstable and enforcement inconsistent, and she did so not by secrecy alone but by mastering the public languages of respectability, medicine, and commerce. Her clients were not caricatures. They were married women and unmarried women, servants and shopkeepers, immigrants and citizens, women navigating a world in which pregnancy could destroy livelihood, reputation, or health. The archive does not preserve their voices clearly. It preserves their desperation indirectly, through demand. Restell's longevity is itself evidence of that demand, though it cannot tell us how each woman experienced her choice. This book does not pretend to recover those interior lives. It refuses to invent them. What it can do is trace the structures that made such a figure possible and the forces that eventually made her intolerable. The 19th century did not suddenly discover abortion and then decide to ban it. Abortifacients, menstrual regulation, and pregnancy termination existed long before they were named as crimes. What changed was who claimed authority over women's bodies. Physicians, overwhelmingly male, sought to professionalize and exclude irregulars. Moral reformers sought to police sexuality through law. Legislators responded to both by tightening statutes that reframed abortion not as a private matter but as a public offense. Madame Restell stood at the center of this realignment. She was not a physician, but she spoke the language of care. She was not clandestine, but she trafficked in discretion. She was not silent, but she was careful. Her existence challenged emerging claims that only credentialed men could speak legitimately about reproduction. That challenge helps explain the ferocity with which she was pursued. Anthony Comstock did not invent the hostility toward Restell, but he crystallized it. By the 1870s, federal power had found a new tool in postal regulation, allowing moral reformers to criminalize information as well as action. Under this regime, knowledge itself became suspect. Advertisements became evidence. Words became crimes. Restell's public presence, once her shield, became her exposure. The state did not defeat her medically. It defeated her administratively. This book treats that ending with restraint. Suicide is not a narrative flourish, it is a human act that resists instrumentalization. It will not be used here to redeem or condemn. It will be situated as what it was, the final consequence of a long campaign that made survival increasingly untenable. An evidence-led history must also be honest about its limits. Much of what is said about Madame Restell in popular accounts is exaggerated, moralist, or speculative. Claims about exact methods, body counts, or singular motives rarely survive close scrutiny. Where the record offers allegation, this book labels it as such. Where the record falls silent, it does not speak in its place. What emerges from that discipline is not a simpler story, but a clearer one. Madame Restell matters not because she represents all abortion providers of her era, she does not, but because she reveals what happens when a woman refuses invisibility in a system that depends on it. Her life exposes the fault lines between private need and public control, between women's autonomy and institutional authority, between commerce and morality. She was not unique in what she provided. She was unique in how long she was allowed to exist. The pages that follow do not ask whether she should have been allowed to exist. That is not a historical question. They ask why she did, and why, eventually, she was no longer permitted to do so. That inquiry begins not in a courtroom or a bathtub, but in the small, carefully worded advertisements that made her both accessible and infamous, a woman offering help in a society determined to pretend that such help was unnecessary. Visibility, in the end, was both her power and her undoing. Chapter 1. A name in the classifieds. In the mid-19th century, New York was a city that taught people to read between lines. It did so not only in politics and commerce, but in the private necessities that could not be spoken plainly without consequence. Newspapers were crowded with offers and warnings, cures and comforts, coded services and coded shame. The city ran on print, advertisements for boarding houses, patent medicines, missing persons, and female complaints, a phrase broad enough to shelter almost anything. It is here, in the classifieds and small type notices, that Madame Restell becomes visible. Not in a clinic ledger. Not in a physician's casebook. Not in the careful language of respectable correspondence. She appears first in public the way a business appears, as a name repeated until it becomes a landmark. A promise made legible through euphemism. A service sold in plain sight, provided you understood the language. The name was a construction. Madame Restell sounded European, professional, and slightly elevated, an expert with an aura of knowledge and discretion. The woman behind it was and Tro Loman, an English-born immigrant who arrived in America in a period when reinvention was not merely possible but necessary. A city like New York rewarded people who could remake themselves faster than their neighbors could verify the past. The question that follows Restell from the beginning is often framed as moral: how could a woman do such work? The better historical question is practical: how could she do it for so long? The answer begins with market conditions, demand, euphemism, and the thin edge of enforcement. A city that needed discretion. To understand Restell's success, it helps to understand that 19th century pregnancy was not simply a private condition. It was an economic event. It could remove a woman from paid work. It could expose her to medical danger. It could bind her to a man who would not support her, or to a marriage that had become violent or untenable. It could become scandal, and scandal could become ruin. New York offered opportunity and anonymity, but it did not offer mercy. It was crowded with young people arriving alone, working in households, shops, and factories. A woman who fell pregnant outside marriage did not merely risk moral condemnation. She risked homelessness, hunger, loss of employment, and institutional punishment. For married women, pregnancy could be financially destabilizing or physically dangerous. Medical care was inconsistent, and childbirth remained perilous. Large families were common not because they were always desired, but because preventing pregnancy reliably was hard, and speaking about prevention publicly was treated as indecent. In this environment, women sought help. They did so quietly, because quiet was safer. Providers existed across the city's social layers: midwives, herbalists, pharmacists, female physicians, and opportunists selling powders and syrups. Most were hard to trace because their work was designed to leave little record. But advertising created a different kind of footprint, and Restell used it deliberately. Her genius was not simply in offering a service. It was in making the offer readable to those who needed it while remaining deniable to those who wanted to prosecute it. Euphemism as infrastructure. Restell's advertisements were not explicit. They did not need to be. Their power lay in recognizable phrases: female irregularities, monthly periods, married ladies, strict privacy, relief, paired with a promise of expertise and discretion. The ad did not have to say what would happen. It only had to signal that Restell understood what the reader could not safely state. This kind of language did more than protect the provider. It created a shared secret in print. A woman could point to an advertisement without naming its purpose aloud. She could frame her inquiry as medical rather than moral. She could approach a provider through a socially acceptable story: health, irregularity, distress. Euphemism functioned as infrastructure. It allowed the market to operate. It also allowed moral reformers and prosecutors to claim, later, that everyone knew exactly what the advertisements meant. This would become a recurring pattern in Restell's history. Language that enabled her business would also become the rope used to tighten law around it. Reinvention and the making of Madam. Restell's story fits a broader pattern of immigrant entrepreneurship. A person arrives without institutional authority and builds credibility through performance, presentation, and commerce. In a time when credentialing systems were still evolving and medical authority was contested, it was possible to claim expertise without a formal license, provided one could convince clients and evade sustained prosecution. Restell cultivated a persona that suggested refinement and skill. She offered not only services but certainty, a solution, presented with confidence, in a world where women were expected to endure uncertainty quietly. Her name became a brand in the modern sense, recognized, repeatable, and linked to a specific promise. Branding mattered because the market she served ran on trust. A woman seeking help with reproduction needed discretion above all else. She needed to believe the provider would not expose her. She needed to believe the provider knew how to avoid attracting attention. She needed to believe she would not be harmed, or at minimum, that her harm would not become public. Trust in this economy did not come from public testimonials. It came from whispered referrals, from repeat business, from the stability of a name that kept reappearing in the paper. Restell became a specialist not only in provision, but in reassurance. The legal landscape before it hardened. One reason Restell could operate in public for so long is that early 19th century abortion law in the United States was not yet uniform or fully systematized. The rules varied by jurisdiction, and enforcement was often inconsistent. Prosecution required complainants, witnesses, or obvious catastrophe, none of which was reliably available in a practice built on secrecy and fear. When the law did intervene, it often did so unevenly. Providers without public profiles were difficult to target. Providers who advertised were easier to name. But naming did not automatically produce conviction. Courts still needed evidence that could survive scrutiny, and abortion, performed in private, discussed in euphemism, did not easily yield evidence in the form authorities preferred. This created a paradox. Restell's visibility made her vulnerable, but the same visibility also made her resilient. She understood how to speak in ways that signaled to clients, while limiting what could be proven from print alone. She operated in a gray zone where many people knew what was happening, yet the state often struggled to demonstrate it to the standard required for punishment. That gap, between public suspicion and legal proof, was the space in which her business flourished. The client's history struggles to see. The women who went to Restell were, by design, not recorded clearly. The archive does not preserve their names in neat lists. It preserves them as occasional figures dragged into public view when something went wrong, or when a case reached court. This is a common frustration in writing evidence-led reproductive history. The people most affected are the people least documented. But the existence of Restell's long career tells its own truth. Demand was not marginal. It was persistent. It crossed class lines. It existed alongside public moral condemnation because condemnation did not eliminate need. It merely forced need to become quieter. To say this is not to romanticize the market. Illicit reproductive services were risky. In an era of uneven medical standards and limited emergency care, complications could be fatal. Some providers were skilled, others were reckless. Some exploited clients financially. Some exploited them sexually. Some offered remedies that did nothing but take money. Some offered help that was real and dangerous. The women seeking services navigated this risk within the options available to them. What makes Restell historically distinct is not that she was the only provider. It is that she became the most legible one. Notoriety as a product. Notoriety did not simply happen to Restell. It was produced around her, by her advertising, by her wealth, by her persistence, and by the needs of those who opposed her. Moral reform movements in the 19th century depended on visible villains. They required examples that could be named and attacked publicly to mobilize support. A faceless market of unnamed midwives was hard to campaign against. A single famous woman, especially one who appeared prosperous, defiant, and unashamed, was far more useful. Restell's public presence allowed opponents to turn an abstract fear into a person. She could be blamed not only for individual acts but for a broader moral anxiety, about women's sexuality, about the weakening of male authority, about the city's anonymity, about commerce unregulated by traditional institutions. She became a symbol precisely because she was identifiable. This, too, is a form of infrastructure, the creation of a public enemy to stabilize a moral narrative. Respectability and the scandal of success. Restell's wealth and social ascent were not incidental details. They were central to her cultural impact. A poor provider could be dismissed as desperate. A wealthy provider suggested something worse, that the business was profitable because it served many, and that it could flourish inside the city's respectable surfaces. Prosperity transforms a crime into a threat. It suggests the behavior is not fringe but widespread enough to support a market. It suggests complicity, printers who ran the advertisements, landlords who rented rooms, suppliers who sold goods, neighbors who looked away. A successful abortion provider was not only breaking law. She was demonstrating that law could be bent. This helps explain the intensity of campaigns against Restell. The goal was not simply to stop one woman. It was to prove that the moral order could still assert itself against a market that was moving faster than traditional control mechanisms. The shape of the story to come. Restell's career can be read as a series of confrontations between private need and public authority. The private need remains largely constant, women seeking to control pregnancy in a society that treated reproductive control as taboo. Public authority changes form across decades, shifting statutes, rising medical professionalization, expanding moral crusades, new policing tools. Restell adapts, and in doing so, she becomes a kind of measuring instrument. Her ability to continue operating indicates where the gaps remain. The moments when she is prosecuted indicate where the state is strengthening its grip. The narrative that follows is therefore not only a biography. It is a study of power, who claims authority over women's bodies, by what means, and with what cultural justifications. The next chapter follows the business itself, How Madame Restell built a durable public identity, how advertising and discretion worked together, and how the city's print culture became both her greatest asset and the most reliable weapon against her. Chapter 2. The Business of Discretion. Madame Restell's notoriety has often been treated as an aberration, a single wicked woman, a single scandal, an unusually lurid corner of 19th-century New York. The record suggests something less theatrical and more instructive. She was the visible crest of a broad, persistent demand, and she built a business that could meet that demand with enough reliability, and enough plausible deniability, to survive repeated attempts to shut it down. What made Restell historically unusual was not that she provided reproductive services. It was that she did so as a brand. In a century when most abortion provision was arranged through whispers and intermediaries, Restell placed her offer into the public bloodstream of the city, the daily newspaper. She let print do what secrecy alone could not: standardize access, stabilize reputation, and scale demand, while still hiding the service in language that could be read by the right people and argued about by everyone else. A market that could not name itself. The New York Restell served was noisy with commerce and quiet with necessity. It produced prosperity and precarity side by side. Women moved through it under constant moral supervision and real economic risk, employment that could vanish with scandal, housing dependent on reputation, marriage that offered legal permanence without necessarily offering safety. This is the condition under which clandestine markets thrive, not because people are immoral, but because their needs cannot be met openly. Restell's business was, at its core, a promise to solve a problem that official life insisted should not exist. That contradiction did not make the market smaller. It made it steadier. Euphemism as a sales strategy and a legal shield. Restell's advertisements did not need to be explicit to be effective. They relied on the shared literacy of euphemism, phrases that signaled function while offering a layer of protection. Female monthly regulating pills, stoppage of the menses, strictest confidence. The phrases did more than advertise. They constructed a social alibi. A woman could approach Restell under the cover of health rather than openly declaring intent. The provider, meanwhile, could claim she was treating female complaints, a category broad enough to frustrate prosecution unless authorities could produce a witness prepared to speak plainly. This was not merely marketing style. It was an operating system. It also had a predictable consequence. Opponents could argue that the euphemisms were thin disguises, while clients could insist they were seeking ordinary medical relief. Restell's business sat in that legal tension, using it as both cover and leverage. From service to brand. Restell's longevity depended on recognizability. In a clandestine market, repeatable trust is everything. A name that appears consistently in print becomes a kind of landmark, a fixed point in a city where women could be isolated by shame or geography. Secondary scholarship and institutional summaries consistently describe Restell as the best-known abortion provider in New York, and emphasize her sustained use of advertising and commerce rather than purely word-of-mouth practice. The American National Biography notes early advertisements appearing around 1839 directing women to visit Madame Restell at an address on Greenwich Street, with the advertising written by her husband, an early signal that this was a joint enterprise in print as much as in practice. Branding did not only attract clients. It also produced a villain useful to moral reformers. A dispersed market of unnamed midwives is difficult to attack. A single famous woman is legible, campaignable, condemnable, repeatable in sermons and headlines. Restell's visibility made her profitable. It also made her useful to her enemies. The product line: pills, powders, and plausible narratives. A key feature of Restell's empire was that it did not rely on one form of provision. Her public identity encompassed multiple offerings: contraceptives, abortifacients, and services framed as women's healthcare. Modern historical writing describes her as building a lucrative business that included patent medicines and reproductive products marketed through the language of female monthly regulation. This breadth served several purposes. It diversified risk. If one avenue drew attention, others could continue. It blurred boundaries. Contraception, regulating, and abortion could be rhetorically bundled under women's complaints, making enforcement harder. It stabilized revenue. Products could be sold without the same logistical burden as in-person services, and print advertising could funnel demand continually. The archive's most stubborn limitation appears here. The exact contents of 19th-century monthly pills are often difficult to pin down with certainty. Advertisements and hostile commentary suggest what the products were for, but composition claims are frequently polemical, inconsistent, or repeated secondhand. Responsible history does not turn that uncertainty into chemistry. It treats the pills as commercial artifacts, sold widely enough to matter, encoded carefully enough to survive, and targeted fiercely enough to become symbols. Space, respectability, and the scandal of success. Restell's later association with Fifth Avenue, wealth and social ascent, was not a decorative detail. It was central to why her story inflamed the public imagination. A poor illegal practitioner could be dismissed as marginal. A prosperous woman advertising in newspapers suggested a far more disturbing possibility to her opponents, that the practice was not fringe at all, but integrated into the city's economic life. Her success implied a network of toleration: printers who took money to run ads, suppliers who sold ingredients and packaging, landlords who rented rooms, neighbors who looked away, officials who did not prioritize enforcement unless pushed. A profitable enterprise rarely belongs to one person alone. It belongs to the conditions that allow it. This is why moral panic fixated not only on what Restell did, but on what she represented: women acting outside sanctioned channels, using commerce to purchase autonomy, and doing so at scale. Enforcement before Comstock: hard to prove, easy to suspect. Restell's earlier prosecutions illuminate how 19th-century law struggled to police private reproductive acts. Abortion cases were difficult to prosecute because they relied heavily on testimony: a client willing to speak, a witness to an event conducted in private, or a catastrophe severe enough to force official attention. The 1841 trial pamphlet connected to the death of Mrs. Purdy is one of the rare surviving compilations that shows the legal theater in detail: how evidence was framed, what was treated as persuasive, and how the unspeakable was spoken in court through a mix of euphemism and accusation. The pamphlet itself must be handled cautiously. It is a constructed public text, shaped by legal argument and editorial intent, not a transparent window into private reality. Even so, it demonstrates something crucial about the era. Authorities often knew what they were looking at, but struggled to convert knowledge into proof without witnesses willing to cross the boundary from coded language into explicit confession. That gap, between suspicion and conviction, was Restell's operating environment for decades. The turning point: moral reform becomes federal power. Restell's downfall did not come because medicine suddenly solved the problem of proof. It came because the state acquired new ways to criminalize the means of access: information, advertising, distribution, rather than relying solely on proving a specific private act. Anthony Comstock's campaign against vice is central here, not as melodrama but as governance. A recent scholarly analysis notes that Comstock arrested Restell on February 11, 1878 for selling contraceptives and abortifacients, and that the looming trial led to her death by suicide on April 1, 1878. The significance is not merely biographical. It shows how the state shifted strategy, from trying to prove what happened in a private room to policing what traveled through public systems: mail, print, commercial distribution. This was an administrative solution to a moral project. It did not require the same kind of witness testimony. It required control of channels. Restell had built her power through those channels. That is why the change was fatal to her model. A business that doubled as a battleground. By the time Comstock targeted Restell, she had already served decades as a symbol in a larger struggle: who controlled reproduction, who could claim medical authority, and what kinds of women could operate publicly without being crushed for it. In popular memory, Restell is often reduced to a single role, either villain or proto-feminist. The record supports a more historically honest frame. She was an entrepreneur of secrecy, operating where demand was stable and the law was uneven, and she became notorious because visibility made her both reachable to clients and irresistible to reformers. Her business model did not survive because the city approved of it. It survived because the city needed it, and because the law could not easily admit that need without destabilizing the moral order it claimed to defend. The next chapter follows the first major collision between Restell's enterprise and the state's attempt to make an example of her, the early prosecutions that reveal how 19th-century courts tried to speak plainly about acts the culture insisted should remain unspoken, until a woman's name made them unavoidable. Chapter 3. The Purdy Case, when euphemism failed in court. Madame Restell's business relied on a fragile arrangement. Everyone understood what her advertisements promised, but few were willing or able to say it plainly in a legal setting. The early abortion prosecutions in New York repeatedly stalled on that boundary. Suspicion was common. Proof was harder. In 1841, that boundary ruptured. The case that brought Intro Lohman, Madame Restell, into one of her earliest major public confrontations with the law did not begin with police surveillance or a raid. It began with a dying woman, a household in panic, and the decision to turn a private secret into a statement that could be taken down, signed, and carried into court. A deathbed statement in a world built on silence. The woman at the center of the case is usually named in later summaries as Maria Purdy, sometimes with fuller naming in library catalog records, and the surviving 19th-century trial pamphlet frames the matter as an abortion causing the death of Mrs. Purdy. The basic outline, repeated across reputable institutional summaries, is stark. Purdy was gravely ill, often described as dying of tuberculosis, and made a confession that she had received an abortion from Madame Restell, with a further claim that her fatal illness resulted from that abortion. That linkage, abortion, illness, death, matters historically, not because it is necessarily medically reliable. 19th-century understanding of tuberculosis and causation was limited, but because it provided the moral and legal fuel required to move a private act into public prosecution. It transformed what might have been treated as female trouble into something the state could frame as homicide or its near equivalent. And crucially, it produced something the abortion marketplace normally denied the courts: a direct narrative. According to later chronologies and educational summaries of the case, a magistrate took Purdy's statement at her home after her husband contacted authorities. The significance of that detail is procedural. It tells us the case did not originate in professional policing. It originated in domestic crisis and in a family's decision, however coerced by fear or grief, to cooperate with the state. What the pamphlet is, and what it isn't. One reason the Purdy case remains so central in Restell's history is that it is attached to a printed trial text sold to the public in 1841, Trial of Madame Restell, alias and Lohman, for abortion and causing the death of Mrs. Purdy, together with the suppressed evidence and editorial remarks. The existence of this publication is itself a historical fact worth treating with care. Trial pamphlets were a 19th-century genre that straddled documentation and sensationalism. They offered the public the feeling of proximity to legal truth, while also being shaped by commercial incentives, editorial commentary, and the biases of whoever assembled them. The title's promise of suppressed evidence and editorial remarks should be read as marketing as much as disclosure. For the historian, the pamphlet is not a transparent window into what really happened. It is something subtler and in some ways more useful, a record of how abortion could be spoken about when forced into court, how witness credibility was constructed, how euphemism was negotiated, and how the public was invited to interpret a woman accused of providing abortions. It shows, in other words, what abortion prosecution looked like when it had to be made legible. How an abortion case becomes prosecutable. Abortions were difficult to prosecute precisely because they were arranged to leave little evidence. The act occurred in private. Participants had every incentive to deny. Medical proof was weak by modern standards. Courts leaned heavily on testimony and on narratives of sequence: who visited whom, who administered what, who became ill when. A deathbed statement changed that calculus. It provided a named provider, rather than a faceless midwife. A direct claim of causation, even if medically contestable. A moral urgency that encouraged officials to act. And most importantly, a witness record that could outlive the witness. This is one of the cruel ironies of the archival record. Women's reproductive lives rarely become visible unless they end in catastrophe. The state did not build its case around ordinary abortion provision. It built it around a death that could be framed as scandal. Restell as defendant, Restell as public object. By 1841, Madame Restell was already becoming something more than a provider. She was becoming a symbol that opponents could point to, a public name attached to private acts. That symbolic usefulness is clear in how widely her legal troubles were reported and recycled, even in later retellings. A visible defendant allowed a broader moral argument to be staged in court. If abortion provision could be framed as a single woman's depravity, the city did not have to confront the larger truth her business implied, that many women sought reproductive control and that a commercial system existed to meet that demand. The trial therefore functioned on two levels. As a prosecution of a specific alleged act, tied to Purdy's statement and death. As a public rehearsal of authority, where the city could assert that it still governed the borders of women's bodies. This is why Restell's early prosecutions matter even when the details are contested. They are not only about Restell. They are about the struggle to turn private reproductive reality into a public crime. The problem of causation, and the usefulness of certainty. Modern readers may recoil at the simplicity with which 19th-century narratives linked abortion to fatal illness. Tuberculosis was common, poorly understood, and frequently fatal. To claim that an abortion caused tuberculosis reads now as medically implausible. But the legal system of the time did not require modern biomedical proof to be persuasive. It required a story that made sense within its moral frame. And the moral frame was ready. A woman seeking abortion could be characterized as fallen. A provider could be characterized as predatory. A death could be characterized as divine or natural punishment. Those characterizations did not need to be proven like chemistry. They needed to be believed. The Purdy case shows how belief enters law, not as private faith, but as public plausibility. Why the Purdy case didn't end Restell. If the state could prosecute Restell in 1841, why did her business not simply collapse? Because the forces sustaining her were larger than any single prosecution. The market remained. The euphemism remained. The economic and social pressures that drove women to seek her remained. And the law, even when it acted, could not erase demand, only increase risk. Restell's endurance is a reminder that prosecution is not the same thing as elimination. It is often a negotiation over visibility. When the state wants the market frightened, it prosecutes. When attention fades, the market reforms itself. The Purdy case, however, altered the shape of that negotiation. It demonstrated that the city could, when suitably provoked, push past euphemism and force the unspeakable into the record. It also demonstrated something else, that Madame Restell, once named publicly in this way, would never again be merely a businesswoman operating in coded print. She had become a public enemy with a proper noun. The hinge into the next phase. The Purdy case is not the endpoint of Restell's legal history. It is the beginning of a pattern, periodic collisions between her enterprise and a state increasingly determined to control reproductive commerce, culminating decades later in a different kind of enforcement. Comstock's use of federal power to police the distribution of contraceptives and abortifacients through the mail. The next chapter follows that tightening net. It moves from one household confession to a broader campaign, how abortion provision became entangled with professional medicine's bid for authority, and how the state learned to attack not only the act, but the channels, advertising, products, and information that made the act accessible. Chapter 4. A profession claims the womb. Madame Restell did not build her business in a legal vacuum. She built it in a period when American law and medicine were still negotiating who had the right to name women's reproductive lives, and who had the right to intervene in them. The 19th century did not discover abortion and then decide to prohibit it. What changed, gradually and then decisively, was authority, who could be trusted to speak about reproduction, who could be licensed to treat it, and which forms of knowledge would be treated as legitimate. Restell's career sits across that change like a fault line. When she first became visible in New York's print culture, abortion provision existed in an uneasy continuum with other forms of women's health care, midwifery, herbal practice, menstrual regulation, contraception, and the sale of patent medicines. By the time her life ended, that continuum had been reclassified. Reproductive control had been drawn into the orbit of obscenity, and the state had acquired a new set of enforcement tools that targeted not only acts, but access, advertisements, devices, medications, and the very circulation of information. This chapter traces how the net tightened, not as a single crackdown, but as a long realignment in which moral reformers and professionalizing physicians found common purpose. The world Restell exploited, blurred boundaries, uneven proof. Before the legal hardening of the mid to late 19th century, prosecution was often constrained by the realities of evidence. Abortions happened in private spaces. Participants had strong incentives to deny or euphemize. Medical certainty was limited. Courts tended to rely on confessions, catastrophic outcomes, or informants willing to speak plainly. That vulnerability in proof created the space in which visible providers could operate. Restell's public presence made her easier to name, but naming was not always enough to convict. She could sell female monthly products under a health framing that was socially readable and legally slippery. The important point is not that abortion was legal in some broad sense. It was that enforcement was often uneven, and legal definitions were still being contested. The practice could be morally condemned while remaining practically difficult to prosecute at scale. Restell's longevity is, in itself, a sign of that friction. A medical profession consolidates power. By the middle of the century, that friction began to resolve, partly because the medical profession was actively trying to resolve it. Physicians were attempting to consolidate authority over care that had traditionally been shared among midwives, herbalists, and women's informal knowledge networks. Abortion was one of the battlegrounds through which this authority could be asserted. Modern medical historical scholarship summarizes this era bluntly: as regulation changed, organized medicine pushed to redraw boundaries around reproductive health, and figures like Restell became highly visible targets within that struggle. A popular history synthesis makes the same core claim in plainer language. 19th-century physicians campaigned to criminalize abortion in part as a way to claim women's reproductive health as their professional domain. This is not a claim that can explain every statute or every prosecution, but it does help explain the direction of change. Abortion moved from being treated as a private moral disorder or a sporadic crime into a public issue through which professions and reform movements could demonstrate power. In this shift, the target was not only abortion. It was also the people who provided reproductive services outside the new professional framework, particularly women who advertised, practiced without sanctioned credentials, and built reputations that competed with male medical authority. Restell did all of these. Criminalization as cultural sorting. Criminalization does more than prohibit an act. It also sorts people into categories: respectable medicine versus quackery, moral womanhood versus sexual disorder, legitimate knowledge versus dangerous information. Restell's public persona, Madam Midwife, female physician, businesswoman, was hard to fit into the categories the century increasingly preferred. She wasn't an anonymous handywoman. She was a known operator with a name that circulated like a trademark. That visibility turned her into a useful emblem, a woman who could carry society's anxiety about changing sexual realities, women's autonomy, and a city's growing anonymity. Reformers did not have to explain the full complexity of reproductive demand if they could pin the issue to a single notorious provider. The reform movement's advantage: make the issue portable. Moral reformers understood something that modern true crime media still understands: a system is hard to attack, but a person is easy to attack. A broad clandestine market is difficult to narrate. A named woman is easy to narrate. This is part of why Restell's story persists. She was not simply prosecuted. She was made legible as a public enemy. The result was a reinforcing cycle. Advertising increases visibility. Visibility increases public outrage. Outrage increases selective enforcement. Enforcement increases notoriety. Notoriety increases visibility. In this cycle, law and culture feed each other. The state appears responsive. The public appears righteous. The underlying demand remains. From policing acts to policing access. The most consequential change in the later 19th century was not merely that abortion became more restricted. It was that the state learned to police channels. This is where Anthony Comstock enters the story, not as melodrama, but as a shift in enforcement strategy. The Comstock Act, 1873, is commonly described as a federal law criminalizing the use of the postal system to distribute materials considered obscene, and it explicitly covered devices, medications, and information related to abortion and contraception. The significance of this approach is structural. It does not require the state to prove a specific procedure occurred in a private room. It allows the state to attack the infrastructure of reproductive control, advertising, mail-order commerce, and printed instruction. It transforms knowledge into contraband. And it reframes reproductive care as moral pollution. Restell's downfall: a public business meets a channel-based crackdown. A scholarly analysis from Cambridge is unusually clear about what happened in 1878. Comstock arrested Restell on February 11, 1878 for selling contraceptives and abortifacients, and her looming trial preceded her suicide on April 1, 1878. Two details here matter for an evidence-led account. Restell was arrested for what she sold and how it circulated, not necessarily for a specific performed abortion at that moment. That aligns with the broader channel policing logic: control distribution, control access. The arrest demonstrates how visibility became a liability once the state prioritized policing the very systems Restell relied on. Her name, her advertising footprint, and her commercial model, assets for decades, could now be reinterpreted as evidence. This is why the end of Restell's story feels abrupt in popular retellings. It isn't that the law suddenly noticed her. It's that the law acquired a method of enforcement that could finally catch up to what she was doing in plain sight. What tightened, exactly? By the late 19th century, three forces had aligned. a professional medical movement that sought clearer jurisdiction over reproductive care and treated irregular providers as competitors. A moral reform movement that framed reproductive control as sexual disorder and public corruption. An enforcement framework that targeted the circulation of reproductive materials and information, reducing reliance on private witnesses. This alignment did not eradicate abortion. It reconfigured it into greater secrecy, higher risk for women, and more power for institutions deciding what counted as legitimate care. Restell's life spans the period when the reconfiguration became enforceable. Restell as a measuring instrument. Restell is sometimes treated as an outlier. In one sense, she was unusually visible, unusually branded, unusually wealthy. But her long survival, and her eventual collapse under a new regime of control, makes her a useful measuring instrument for the century's shift. Her early career shows what was possible when enforcement struggled with proof and euphemism did the work of concealment. Her end shows what became possible once the state treated reproductive access as a matter of mail, print, and contraband. The story is not simply about one woman's morality. It is about a society deciding, over decades, how much it feared women's autonomy, and how far it was willing to go to constrain it. The next chapter returns to Restell herself at the moment when her business becomes not only a service but an emblem, how she publicly defended her work, how opponents framed her as a civic threat, and how the cultural fight over abortion was waged not only in courtrooms and statutes, but in the daily churn of newspapers that made her name impossible to forget. Chapter 5. A public enemy in a private market. Madame Restell's longevity created an odd kind of proof. It did not prove what she did in any single room on any single day. It proved that a woman could become publicly known for providing female relief, and continue to operate anyway, through decades of shifting law, shifting moral fashion, and shifting medical authority. That endurance was intolerable to the people who needed abortion to remain both ubiquitous and officially deniable. A clandestine market can be endured, even quietly exploited, so long as it remains nameless. A branded provider, printed, repeated, recognizable, forces a different confrontation. She makes hypocrisy hard to maintain. Restell therefore became more than a businesswoman. She became a civic object, a woman onto whom the city could project anxieties about sex, commerce, immigration, class mobility, and women's refusal to suffer silently. Her story, from this point forward, is not only a record of what she did. It is a record of what was done to her name. Notoriety as a product of repetition. The engine of Restell's fame was the newspaper, an institution that simultaneously enabled her market and fed the moral panic that sought to destroy it. This is not a contradiction. It is how modern urban culture works. Newspapers needed advertising revenue. They also needed scandal. Restell supplied both. Her business could pay for space, and her existence could be used to produce outrage, sermons in print, and civic self-congratulation. She was, in effect, a renewable resource for the public sphere. The same name could be used again and again to signal that the city was battling vice, even when vice continued. This repetition is why Restell persists in memory. Many 19th-century providers likely served more clients, took greater risks, or performed more dangerous procedures. They did not become famous because they did not become printable. Restell was printable. The city's hunger for a female villain. To campaign against abortion in the abstract is difficult. Abstract campaigns require sustained explanation: why women seek termination, how clandestine markets operate, how law and medicine fail to meet need. That complexity weakens moral certainty. It asks the public to think rather than to condemn. A named woman makes condemnation easy. Restell was useful because she condensed an entire system into a single figure: the provider as corrupter, the woman as danger, the market as moral decay embodied in one address, one advertisement, one madam. This process is older than tabloids. It is a well-worn mechanism of social control. When a culture struggles to acknowledge the conditions that produce widespread behavior, it locates the behavior in a person and punishes the person as a substitute for confronting the conditions. Restell became the substitute. The logic was circular but effective. If she was famous, the work must be rampant. If the work was rampant, she must be particularly wicked. If she was wicked, the public's fascination was justified. The result was not merely legal pressure. It was reputational warfare. Respectability as provocation. Restell's opponents did not only condemn what she sold. They condemned what she represented: a woman who gained wealth and social standing through a service officially framed as shameful. Prosperity in this context was evidence. It suggested demand. It suggested repeat customers. It suggested that respectable society, wives, widows, ladies, was participating in a market that public morality claimed to reject. That implication was dangerous. It threatened to expose the distance between the public story and the private one. So Restell's prosperity had to be reframed as something else, not proof of women's unmet need, but proof of her predation. A wealthy abortion provider was easier to hate if she could be portrayed as exploiting desperate women for profit, rather than as meeting a demand created by social and economic constraint. The culture did what it often does to women who succeed in taboo industries. It treated their success as a personal moral failure rather than as a social mirror. What we can and can't say about her practice. At this point in most popular accounts, the narrative tends to harden into either lurid detail or heroic myth. Both are historically risky. The evidence base for Restell's specific day-to-day practice is uneven. We have advertisements, prosecutions, hostile commentary, and later summaries. We have claims made in court and claims made for public consumption. But we do not have the kind of comprehensive clinical documentation that would allow a modern writer to describe her methods with certainty. That absence is not an invitation to invention. An evidence-led account can say, she offered products and services understood by contemporaries to procure relief from pregnancy and prevent conception. She operated with enough organization to become famous. She was prosecuted, she adapted, she remained active for decades. What it should not do is turn allegations into technical detail or present a singular Restell method as settled fact. The business was real. The exact mechanics, in many instances, are less recoverable than later storytellers pretend. This is one reason her enemies leaned so heavily on moral framing. When proof is hard, persuasion becomes cultural. The counter-narrative, Restell's claim to legitimacy. Restell's public persona was not simply a disguise. It was a claim. By calling herself Madam and presenting as a women's health specialist, she positioned her work within a broader 19th century world of female physicians, midwives, and patent medicine providers, figures who operated in the porous space between formal medical authority and practical household care. This claim mattered. It offered clients a way to think of what they were doing not as criminality but as treatment. It also directly challenged emerging medical gatekeeping. If a woman could provide reproductive care outside the male profession and be sought after, then the profession's monopoly was not natural. It had to be enforced. Restell's existence therefore became a provocation not only to moral reformers, but to professional medicine, a reminder that women's needs were not automatically routed through licensed men. That provocation helps explain the persistence of efforts to shut her down. She was not merely breaking rules. She was undermining the authority of those who wanted to write the rules. Newspapers as both shield and weapon. The newspaper did not just make Restell famous, it made her survivable. Advertising allowed a scale and consistency that whispered referral could not. Print also created a kind of distributable discretion. A woman could find Restell without asking anyone. She could pretend she stumbled upon the notice by accident. She could hold the paper like a shield, proof that the service existed in public, which made it feel less like a personal transgression and more like a social fact. But the same print culture also made Restell vulnerable. Every advertisement could be clipped, quoted, mocked, used as evidence of intent. Every repetition created another trail. The newspaper preserved her promise in ink, allowing reformers to argue that the city was being poisoned not only by acts, but by the public circulation of immoral offers. This is the turning mechanism of her story. The tool that built her also built the case against her. Reformers learned to attack distribution, not merely action. By the late 19th century, reformers had learned an enforcement lesson that had been implicit for decades. Private acts are hard to police, but public channels are easier. You don't need to prove what happened in a room if you can control what enters the room: information, products, devices, advertisements. You don't need a cooperative client if you can produce a seized letter, a purchased item, a printed claim. This shift marks the approach of the Comstock era, when morality campaigns became increasingly administrative. The target was not only abortion as an act, but abortion as a market, and markets rely on distribution. Restell's public identity was, by then, a liability that could finally be exploited systematically. The making of an exemplary target. Moral crusades do not simply enforce law, they stage morality. They need exemplary cases. They need a person whose punishment will be interpreted as a victory. Restell was ideal for exemplarity. She was famous enough that her fall would be legible to the public. Wealthy enough that punishment could be framed as righteous leveling. Female enough that her condemnation could reinforce scripts of proper womanhood. And connected enough to implicate respectable society without naming too many respectable clients directly. This last point is critical. A true crackdown on abortion would have required confronting the scale of demand and the social status of many of the women who sought help. That confrontation risked destabilizing the very moral order reformers claimed to protect. An exemplary target solved the problem, punish the provider, hint at elite complicity, avoid naming names. In this arrangement, Restell functioned as a lightning rod. She drew the strike so the wider landscape could remain intact. The hinge to 1878. By the time Restell reached her final years, the story had shifted. In earlier decades, she survived by navigating proof and euphemism. In the 1870s, she faced an enforcement regime built to treat euphemism as confession and distribution as crime. When Anthony Comstock moved against her, he did so as part of a broader system that no longer required the old kind of witness-based certainty. It required access to channels, mail, print, commerce. And Restell, visible, branded, repeated in the public sphere, was now vulnerable in precisely the way she had spent a lifetime trying not to be. The next chapter follows that final encounter, how Comstock's methods worked, why Restell's arrest was not merely another prosecution but a different kind of trap, and how a life built on controlled visibility ended in the most private act available to her, an ending that has been mythologized ever since, often at the expense of understanding what it actually signified. Not a melodramatic fall. A collision between a woman's long-standing enterprise and a state that had finally built the machinery to make her impossible. Chapter 6. The Comstock Trap, when the channel became the crime. Madame Restell survived for decades because the state struggled to prosecute what happened in private. Abortion provision was arranged to defeat observation, no neutral witnesses, no paper trail, a culture of euphemism, and a legal system that relied heavily on testimony and plausibility rather than forensic certainty. Her downfall came when enforcement stopped trying to prove the private act and began policing access, the channels that made private acts possible. Anthony Comstock did not invent the hostility that surrounded Restell, but he perfected a method that made hostility operational. He used the postal system and obscenity enforcement to criminalize not only pornography, but information, devices, and medicines connected to reproductive control. In that regime, the act no longer needed to be witnessed in a bedroom. It was enough to intercept what traveled through public systems. This was not a shift in morality. It was a shift in tactics. A man made of procedure. Comstock is often written as a zealot, an easy villain in the story of 19th-century repression. The record supports the zealotry, but it also reveals why he was so effective. He understood that moral campaigns need paperwork. They need warrants, affidavits, seizures, charges, and court dates. He turned outrage into process. A recent scholarly analysis makes the key point plainly. Comstock arrested many people, but few were as famous as Madame Restell, whom he arrested on February 11, 1878 for selling contraceptives and abortifacients. The same analysis stresses an often missed distinction. Because Restell is remembered chiefly as an abortion provider, many assume her arrest was for performing an abortion, but that assumption is not fully accurate. The arrest was about what she sold and the legal leverage available to reach it. This matters for how we tell the story. It keeps us from writing the arrest as a sudden moral epiphany by the state. It was a calculated engagement with a known target, using a strategy designed to bypass the evidentiary weaknesses of abortion prosecutions. The law that made the mail a weapon. The Comstock Act, passed in 1873, criminalized the use of the postal system to send obscene materials and, crucially, extended that to articles and information intended for abortion or contraception. To modern eyes, it can feel absurd that contraception and abortion could be treated as obscenity. But in Comstock's framework, this classification solved a problem. Obscenity law did not require the state to prove a private sexual act. It required the state to prove a public transmission. Once the mail was criminalized as a channel, evidence became easier to manufacture. Buy the item, seize the pamphlet, produce the packaging, display the instrument, introduce the printed instructions. The state could build a case without relying on a frightened client willing to testify. Restell's business model, public, commercial, advertised, was perfectly suited to be caught by this net. The sting, turning a customer into an investigator. What Comstock did next was not unusual for his career. He posed as a customer. Later summaries describe him approaching Restell under the pretext of seeking birth control for his wife, then returning with police to arrest her and search her home. The detail matters less as drama than as structure. Comstock did not stumble into evidence. He arranged it. He created the transaction that would become proof. This is why the Comstock era marks a turning point. Earlier prosecutions required catastrophe, death, confession, panic. Under Comstock, the state could generate an offense by compelling a sale and treating the sale as contraband. The reform movement became operationally self-sufficient. February 11, 1878, a famous door, a warrant, a seizure. On February 11, 1878, Comstock arrested Restell. Contemporary reporting and later institutional accounts converge on the elements that mattered legally: printed materials on reproductive health, products and powders, and items characterized as instruments, all of which could be reframed as evidence of unlawful intent under the new enforcement logic. Even in accounts sympathetic to Restell, the same architecture appears: the raid, the seizure, the reclassification of her household and office space as a crime scene. This is an important methodological point for an evidence-led narrative. We do not need to overstate what was found or speculate about every object. The state did not need perfect knowledge. It needed enough material to tell a story of intent. And intent, once attached to a famous name, becomes contagious. Why this arrest was different from the earlier ones. Restell had faced prosecution before, most notably in the 1841 Purdy case, where the state's argument was anchored to a dying woman's statement and a contested claim of causation. That earlier model depended on fragile human testimony, and it exposed the courts to the uncertainties of medicine and credibility. Comstock's model was cleaner. It was administrative and documentary. No death required. No cooperative client required. No proof of a procedure required. No need to explain what happened in a room. The crime could be located in the public world of transmission: printed matter, medicines, devices, and the channels by which they moved. For Restell, this meant that the very tools that had made her powerful, advertising, recognizability, product lines, became liabilities. She was no longer being challenged on the ambiguity of euphemism. She was being challenged on the materiality of commerce. The weeks that followed, shame, pressure, and the narrowing of options. It is tempting to write Restell's final weeks as pure melodrama, the infamous abortionist trapped at last by the righteous reformer. That script is emotionally satisfying and historically lazy. What the record supports is a colder reality: an older woman, publicly notorious, facing a legal machine built to grind high-profile targets into examples. The Cambridge analysis frames the outcome plainly. Restell's arrest and looming trial led her to commit suicide by slitting her throat on April 1, 1878. Britannica confirms the date of death and the broad outline of her life as a provider and purveyor of contraceptives, underscoring that by the end she was an established figure whose case carried symbolic weight. A later historical commentary that quotes contemporary press reporting notes that her death was ruled a suicide by the coroner and that the New York Times reported her death prominently on April 2, 1878. This is the material truth of her ending: she did not die quietly. Even in death, she became copy. Suicide as a historical fact, not a narrative solution. Suicide is often used in true crime and historical writing as punctuation: guilt, shame, poetic justice, a final confession without words. That is not responsible here. All we can say with confidence is what the strongest sources support. Restell died by suicide on April 1, 1878 after her arrest and in the shadow of a looming trial. We cannot responsibly claim a single reason: fear of prison, collapse of reputation, exhaustion, rage, grief, defiance, because a single reason would be a story, not a document. The more honest reading is structural. Comstock's method narrowed her options while amplifying her public exposure. The end point of that narrowing was a private act that became instantly public. In a market defined by discretion, she died without it. What Comstock won, and what he didn't. Comstock's arrest of Restell is often written as a decisive victory. In one sense, it was: the most famous reproductive entrepreneur of her era was neutralized, and her death reinforced the reformer's aura of power. But the larger market did not disappear. The demand did not disappear. What changed was the shape of access: deeper secrecy, higher risk, and more surveillance of information itself. The Comstock Act's core logic, treating reproductive knowledge and materials as contraband in public channels, would outlive Restell by generations, and would be periodically revived in later legal and political disputes precisely because it targets infrastructure rather than private intent. Restell's death did not resolve the conflict. It clarified it. Where this leaves the story. Restell's life began in coded print and ended under a regime that treated coded print as criminal evidence. Her career demonstrates the long arc of 19th-century reproductive governance, the shift from irregular markets tolerated in practice to a moral legal system that policed access, distribution, and information with increasing aggression. The next chapter steps back from the arrest to examine the afterlife, how Restell was remembered, how her name was used as propaganda by both opponents and later writers, and why her story became one of the most durable templates for turning reproductive conflict into a battle between a single bad woman and the state, when the real subject has always been the private needs of countless women and the public systems built to control them. Chapter 7. Afterlives, How Madame Restell Became a Template. Madame Restell's death was immediate news. Her life became a long-running argument. In April 1878, the story moved quickly from arrest to obituary, from legal trouble to moral interpretation. Newspapers treated her death as a climax, reformers treated it as proof, and later writers treated it as material, something to be recycled, embellished, simplified, or weaponized. Restell's afterlife as a public figure did not depend on new evidence. It depended on how useful her name remained to people who wanted a symbol. This is one of the central truths of reproductive history in the 19th century. The archive does not merely preserve conflict. It extends it. The past becomes a tool, and named women become handles that later generations can grab. Restell became one of the most grabbable handles of all. The immediate afterlife, a death that confirmed the script. Because Restell died by suicide in the shadow of Comstock's arrest and a looming trial, her death was instantly interpretable. The moral reform narrative did not need to build a complicated explanation. It already had one. To reformers, suicide could be framed as the collapse of vice under the weight of righteousness. To hostile journalists, it could be framed as cowardice or depravity. To sympathetic readers, it could be framed as persecution. The core fact, she died by suicide on April 1, 1878, remained stable in reputable accounts. The meaning of that fact did not. This divergence between fact and meaning is exactly where myth begins to creep in. People fill emotional gaps with moral certainty. They treat interpretation as evidence. They narrativize a death because it feels necessary to make the story feel complete. But history rarely provides completeness. It provides, at best, a set of traceable events and a set of competing claims about what those events show. Restell's afterlife is built on that competition. The Reformer's Trophy, Why Comstock Needed Restell to Remain Famous. Comstock's enforcement strategy relied on visibility. A moral crusade needs victories the public can recognize, and the public recognizes victories through names. Restell's notoriety made her an ideal trophy, and her death amplified the victory because it spared Comstock the uncertainty of trial. A trial is risky. It can expose evidentiary weakness. It can give the defendant a platform. It can generate sympathy. A suicide collapses those risks. The Crusaders' narrative is left intact, unchallenged by cross-examination, and can be used to demonstrate power. This is part of why Restell remains attached to Comstock in modern scholarship and popular writing. She illustrates the shift from policing private acts to policing public channels, and she offers a dramatic endpoint that makes that shift memorable. In this framework, Restell becomes less a person than a demonstration. The other afterlife, Restell as a warning to women. At the same time, her story was used as a cautionary tale aimed not only at providers but at women seeking reproductive control. Her life allowed opponents of abortion and contraception to imply a chain of degradation, desire, sin, secrecy, death. If a famous provider could be destroyed, so could the women who relied on her. The cultural function of such cautionary tales is discipline. They do not merely discourage behavior. They teach women what happens when private need becomes public scandal. They reinforce the idea that discretion must be absolute and that seeking help is itself a risk. In practice, the effect is not elimination of demand but deepening of concealment. The people with the fewest resources, servants, migrants, unmarried women, become most vulnerable because they have fewer safe channels and fewer protections if something goes wrong. Restell's afterlife therefore had consequences beyond her own biography. It shaped the emotional landscape in which reproductive decisions were made. A template emerges, the notorious abortionist as cultural figure. After Restell, the figure of the notorious abortionist becomes a recognizable type in Anglo-American cultural memory. The type has stable features. She is a woman or madam with a foreign-sounding name. She is coded as predatory or corrupting. She is linked to wealth, secrecy, and decadence. She is pursued by moral reformers. She falls as an example to others. This type survives because it is narratively efficient. It personalizes a structural issue. It allows a society to treat reproductive conflict as a battle between a single bad actor and law, rather than as a persistent social reality shaped by poverty, gender dependency, and limited options. Restell helped create this template because she was so visible and so long-lived. She offered later generations a ready-made story shape: rise, scandal, crackdown, fall. It is also why later writing about her is often unreliable. Once a person becomes a template, facts become optional. The danger of body count storytelling. One of the most common distortions in Restell retellings is the urge to quantify: how many abortions did she perform? How many women died? How many babies were destroyed? Numbers create the illusion of certainty and scale. They also allow moral arguments to masquerade as statistics. The problem is that clandestine provision rarely produces reliable counts. Most of the work leaves no record. When records do exist, they are often hostile, selective, or exaggerated for effect. Restell's fame creates a further distortion. Deaths that occurred in the city could be attributed to her by rumor because her name was available as an explanation. An evidence-led account refuses this lure. It does not produce a number where the archive cannot support one. It instead treats longevity and notoriety as proxy indicators. Restell served enough clients, and was known widely enough, to become a sustained target. That is significant on its own. The myth of the secret recipe, and the false certainty of method. Another durable distortion is technical myth, the idea that Restell possessed a singular formula, a secret recipe, or a definitive set of techniques that can be described cleanly. This is partly a narrative hunger. Readers want mechanisms. They want to picture what happened. They want the story to be concrete. But clandestine markets do not produce clean technical documentation, and 19th-century reproductive products were often marketed through broad claims and euphemism rather than precise ingredients lists. Later writers often fill that gap with speculative chemistry or recycled folklore. A responsible approach treats monthly pills and female remedies as commercial categories rather than precise formulas. It acknowledges what is knowable: these products were sold, they were intended to regulate menstruation and prevent or terminate pregnancy, and refuses to overspecify what remains uncertain. This restraint is not coyness. It is accuracy. Who gets erased in the afterlife? The clients. Restell's afterlife, like most offender or provider-centered narratives, tends to erase the people who created the demand: women seeking control over pregnancy. The archive does this too. It preserves Restell's name because she was prosecuted and written about. It preserves Comstock's name because he produced documents, raids, and speeches. It rarely preserves the names of clients because their lives were designed to remain intact through secrecy, and because exposure could destroy them. This imbalance produces a misleading moral impression. It makes abortion history look like the story of providers and crusaders, rather than the story of women making decisions in constrained circumstances. Restell's true historical significance lies partly here. Her existence is evidence that women sought reproductive control in large enough numbers to sustain a branded enterprise. But because those women are largely invisible, later storytellers treat the provider as the primary actor, when in fact the primary actor was demand. Restell in modern memory: heroine, villain, or business case study. Modern writing about Restell tends to polarize. Some accounts treat her as a feminist precursor, a woman providing needed care in a hostile society. Others treat her as a criminal profiteer. Still others treat her as a case study in marketing and entrepreneurship. Each frame contains partial truth and partial distortion. Restell did provide services women sought, and her longevity suggests she met real demand. She also profited from that demand, and profit can coexist with care and with exploitation. The archive does not allow us to romanticize her, but it also does not allow us to reduce her to caricature without losing the structural realities her story reveals. The most historically useful stance is neither hero worship nor demonization. It is analysis. She was a reproductive entrepreneur operating in an unstable legal landscape who became a symbolic target when law acquired the mechanisms to police distribution and information. That does not tell the reader what to feel. It tells the reader what happened. What her afterlife teaches us about 19th century control. Restell's story endures because it speaks to a recurrent pattern. Private need persists regardless of public moral condemnation. Markets develop to meet that need, often through euphemism and discretion. Authorities struggle to prosecute private acts. Reformers shift strategy to attack public channels instead. A visible target is punished to symbolize victory. The market adapts and becomes quieter, not necessarily smaller. Restell's fall was real. The victory over reproductive control was not. It was a victory over visibility. Where this leaves the book. By this point, the outlines of Restell's life are clear: immigrant reinvention, a business built through coded print, early prosecutions that struggled with proof, and a final crackdown that treated access as contraband. Her death concludes the biography, but not the historical conflict. The final chapter draws these threads together. It returns to the question this book began with: why Restell, of all providers, became so famous, and what her fame reveals about how a society disciplines women through law, medicine, and moral panic while quietly relying on the services it condemns. Madame Restell did not create the private market. She became the face that allowed the public to pretend it could control it. Chapter 8. What Restell reveals: power, secrecy, and the law's need for a woman to blame. Madame Restell's story is often told as an exception, a notorious abortionist who rose and fell in 19th century New York, pursued by a moral crusader and ended by her own hand. It is an easy shape. It fits neatly into the cultural preference for single villains and clean endings. But Restell is not most useful as an exception. She is most useful as a diagnostic, a case that exposes how a society manages private need when it cannot admit that need openly, and how law, medicine, and media collaborate, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by habit, to make certain kinds of women bear the weight of public anxiety. If you want an evidence-led, historically factual nonfiction book, this is the chapter that keeps you honest. It clarifies what the archive can support, what it cannot, and why the temptation to mythologize Restell is so persistent. 1. Restell became famous because she was legible, not because she was unique. The first and most important conclusion is simple: Restell's visibility is the reason she survives in the record. Thousands of abortions and attempted abortions occurred in 19th century America. Most left no usable trace. Providers were unnamed, referred to only as a midwife, a woman, a person of ill fame, a female physician. Clients were protected by euphemism, fear, and the practical need to keep living. Restell is different because she built a public-facing identity. Her name was printed repeatedly. Her services were marketed in coded language. Her addresses were known. Her persona was durable enough to become a shorthand for a broader phenomenon. That is not merely a biographical detail. It's a methodological warning. The archive will always overrepresent the visible. If Restell feels central to abortion history, it is partly because she is one of the few providers whose life was repeatedly dragged into public documentation. She becomes the story because she is available as a story. 2. The market did not depend on depravity, it depended on constraint. Restell's critics wanted her work to signify moral collapse. A society can tolerate the existence of clandestine services if it believes they serve only bad women. That belief allows respectable people to look away. Restell's existence threatened that belief. A branded provider, one who could operate in open commerce, implied a broad clientele. It implied that women who looked respectable, who had marriages, households, reputations, and church attendance, were also seeking reproductive control. It implied that the market was not a fringe corruption but a practical response to constraint. Constraint takes many forms in the 19th century record: economic insecurity, the precariousness of women's employment, the legal permanence of marriage, the physical risk of repeated pregnancy, the narrow moral tolerance for female sexuality, the absence of reliable, openly discussed contraception, and the punitive social consequences of pregnancy outside marriage. Restell did not invent these constraints. She monetized a way through them, sometimes framed as care, sometimes framed as commerce, always framed as discretion. The market's existence is not proof of mass depravity. It is proof of mass need in a world that would not dignify that need with public language. 3. The law's real shift was procedural. It stopped chasing the bedroom and started chasing the channel. One of the most valuable things Restell's biography shows is how enforcement changed. Early prosecutions, like the Purdy case, reveal the state's difficulty. Private acts are hard to prosecute without witnesses, confessions, or catastrophe. The older model of control depended on breaking secrecy from the inside, through informants, deathbed statements, or public scandal. The Comstock era introduced a new model, channel control. Once the state treated reproductive materials and information as contraband in public systems, mail, print, commerce, it could prosecute without needing to reconstruct what happened in a room. It could manufacture evidence through purchase and seizure. It could criminalize possession, distribution, and instruction. This procedural shift matters because it clarifies why Restell's story ends the way it does. She didn't lose because the state finally proved what she did privately. She lost because the state built machinery that could punish her without proving the private act. This is the core lesson of Comstock. When the state cannot control private behavior directly, it often controls access instead. 4. Professional medicine didn't merely advance, it competed. Restell's career also intersects with the 19th century professionalization of medicine. This period was not simply a march toward better science. It was also a consolidation of authority, who could call themselves a legitimate provider, whose knowledge counted, and who would be excluded. Women like Restell, midwives, female physicians, patent medicine entrepreneurs, occupied a space that formal medicine increasingly wanted to claim. Even when physicians framed abortion opposition as moral or medical, it also functioned as a jurisdictional boundary. Reproductive care would be relocated under male professional control, and irregulars would be criminalized, ridiculed, or pushed out. Restell's visibility made her a convenient target in that contest. She represented a woman claiming competence in the most symbolically charged domain of all, reproduction. Her elimination reinforced the message that legitimate authority belonged elsewhere. 5. The press did not simply report the case, it helped create it. Restell's story is unintelligible without the newspaper. Print made her discoverable to clients and condemnable to reformers. It created a stable identity that could be attacked repeatedly. It amplified prosecutions into morality theater. It turned euphemism into a public wink, understood enough to scandalize without being explicit enough to violate decorum. This is why Restell's afterlife is so myth-prone. Once the press makes a woman into a symbol, later writers inherit a ready-made character rather than a complicated person. The temptation becomes narrative efficiency: repeat the nickname, sharpen the villainy, inflate the certainty, compress the context. An evidence-led history must resist this inherited theater. It must treat headlines as sources with motives, not as verdicts. 6. Restell cannot be responsibly reduced to heroine or monster. Modern readers often arrive with a desire to categorize: was Restell a women's savior or a predatory criminal? The archive does not support a clean answer, and forcing one creates bad history. She operated in a market that responded to real constraints and desperation. She profited from that market. She offered discretion, an essential commodity in a punitive society. She was pursued by reformers whose methods criminalized information as well as action. She was not the market, she was a visible node within it. To write her as hero is to risk sanitizing exploitation and risk. To write her as monster is to risk erasing the social reality that made her services demanded. The honest position is harder but more accurate. Restell was an entrepreneur of reproductive secrecy, and the society that denounced her relied on the conditions that made her viable. 7. The missing center of the story is the clients, and that absence is itself evidence. The most ethically charged fact about this history is also the most methodologically stubborn: the women who sought Restell are largely lost to us. They remain absent because secrecy protected them, because confession could ruin them, because institutions preserved the story of prosecution more diligently than the story of need, because women's reproductive lives were treated as shameful rather than historically important. This absence shapes every retelling. It pulls narrative gravity toward the famous provider and the famous crusader. It makes the story look like a duel between two public figures, when the deeper reality was a sustained pattern of private decision-making by countless women. An evidence-led book must name this imbalance, rather than pretending to solve it. You can't restore voices that aren't there, but you can refuse to let their absence be interpreted as their irrelevance. 8. What Restell's end actually signifies. Restell's suicide has been used as punctuation: guilt, shame, punishment, poetic justice, martyrdom. The archive supports the fact of her death, but it does not support a single meaning. What her end does signify reliably is structural. The state had built an enforcement regime that made her continued operation untenable. Her public notoriety ensured maximum exposure and maximum symbolic stakes. A life built on controlled discretion ended under uncontrolled public scrutiny. This is not a moral lesson. It is a historical one. When the state turns channel control into morality enforcement, the consequences are not evenly distributed. The most visible targets absorb the blow. 9. Why Restell still matters. Restell matters because she shows how power works when it cannot admit its own dependencies. Her existence revealed a truth that public moral order tried to conceal. Women sought reproductive control, and a city could not prevent the desire through condemnation alone. The law eventually responded not by erasing the desire, but by criminalizing access and information. That pattern, private need persisting, markets adapting, authority punishing visibility, infrastructure becoming the battleground, recurs across centuries because it is rooted in governance, not in one woman's biography. Madame Restell did not create the conflict. She became the name that allowed the conflict to be talked about without ever fully naming what was at stake: women's capacity to decide what happens to their bodies in a society determined to claim that decision as public property. Closing the book without pretending to close the argument. This book has been written with restraint because restraint is a form of accuracy. Where the record provides dates, prosecutions, and public documents, it speaks clearly. Where it cannot show us the inside of a private room, it stops. Where it tempts us toward technical certainty or neat motives, it refuses. That refusal is not an absence of craft. It is an ethical stance. Madame Restell survives as a story because she was legible. The women who needed her survive mostly as shadows because their world demanded secrecy. The state survives as the final narrator because it produced the paperwork. The task of historical true crime is to recognize that imbalance and write against it. Restell's name still carries heat. Not because she was the only provider. Not because she was the most monstrous or the most heroic. But because she became, for a time, the place where private lives and public power collided in a way the archive could not look away from. And once the archive looks, it never stops looking. Chapter 9. Epilogue: What a Named Woman Can Carry. Madame Restell is remembered because she was unusually easy to point at. Most 19th century abortion provision lives in the archive as fog: unnamed midwives, unrecorded transactions, euphemisms that dissolve into silence. Restell, by contrast, left a crisp outline. She placed her name into print. She repeated it until it became a landmark. She built a business that could be found without asking anyone for directions. That visibility did not merely make her accessible to clients. It made her useful. A society can endure a clandestine market as long as it stays diffuse, hard to narrate, harder to prosecute, easy to deny. A named woman collapses that diffusion. She turns a broad social reality into something that looks like a single source. When anxiety needs an object, a name becomes a handle. Restell became that handle for decades. The central contradiction. What the record keeps showing, even in hostile language, is that public outrage and private demand were not opposites. They were coexisting forces. Her profitability and longevity sat alongside moral panic because the need for reproductive control persisted regardless of condemnation. This contradiction, abortion condemned, abortion sought, contraception taboo, contraception purchased, women shamed, women still deciding, did not weaken the system. It stabilized it. Hypocrisy is often a form of social management. It allows people to behave one way in private while affirming the opposite in public. Restell's business didn't break that hypocrisy. It exposed it. Why the end mattered so much. Her arrest on February 11, 1878 and her death by suicide on April 1, 1878 have become the bookends through which people read her whole life. But the most historically important part of that ending is not its drama. It's its mechanism. Comstock-era enforcement shifted attention from the private room to the public channel: mail, print, distribution, articles, and information. The state no longer needed to prove what happened in a bedroom. It could criminalize what moved through the world on paper and in parcels. This is why Restell, so comfortable in the public infrastructure of advertising and commerce, became newly vulnerable. A business built on controlled visibility met an enforcement regime designed to treat visibility as evidence. Her story ends where the century ends up, with reproductive control reframed as contraband and knowledge treated as moral contamination. The client-shaped absence. The most stubborn absence in Restell's story is not a missing document. It's missing people. Her clients rarely remain visible because secrecy protected them, and exposure could destroy them. The archive preserves the state's voice, arrests, seizures, commentary, prosecution, more reliably than it preserves women's reasons. This imbalance is not accidental. It reflects whose lives were considered record-worthy. That absence does not mean the clients were marginal. It means the culture was structured to keep them unnamed. Restell's existence, paradoxically, is part of the evidence of that hidden population. A branded enterprise does not survive for decades on anomaly. It survives on repeatable demand. A note on myth, and why this book refuses it. Restell's afterlife has attracted two temptations. Technical certainty, the secret recipe, the clean method, the knowable procedure. Moral certainty, saint or monster, liberator or predator. Both temptations make the story easier to consume. Both distort the historical record. The most responsible conclusion is more uncomfortable and more accurate. Restell was a reproductive entrepreneur working in an economy of constraint, discretion, and uneven enforcement. She was pursued not because she was the only provider, but because she was the most legible one. What remains? Madame Restell's name endures because it performs cultural work. It allows a society to locate blame in a person rather than in conditions. It allows the public to treat reproductive conflict as a moral drama, one bad woman, one righteous crusader, instead of an ongoing struggle over who controls women's bodies and how much violence a society will apply to maintain that control. Her life is not a relic. It is a pattern made visible. And the most lasting lesson is not that one woman was powerful enough to change the city's private behavior. It is that the city's private behavior was powerful enough to create a market, and the state, eventually, powerful enough to punish the woman whose name made that market impossible to deny. Bibliography. Primary sources. Trial pamphlets and legal documents. Trial of Madame Restell, alias and Lohman, for abortion and causing the death of Mrs. Purdy, together with the suppressed evidence and editorial remarks. New York, 1841. United States Congress. An Act for the Suppression of Trade in and Circulation of Obscene Literature and Articles of Immoral Use. 17 Stat 598, 1873. Newspapers, contemporaneous. New York Times. Coverage of Madame Restell's arrest and death February, April 1878. New York Herald. Coverage of abortion prosecutions and moral reform campaigns, 1840s, 1870s. New York Tribune. Reporting on vice suppression and Comstock-era enforcement, 1870s. Secondary sources. Biographical and reference works. Encyclopedia Britannica. Madame Restell. New York Historical Society. Madame Restell. Women and the American Story. Scholarly articles and monographs. Beisel, Nicola. Imperiled Innocence, Anthony Comstock and Family Reproduction in Victorian America. Princeton, New Jersey, Princeton University Press, 1997. Cambridge University Press. Anthony Comstock, Abortion, and the Arrest of Madame Restell. Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. Gordon, Linda. The Moral Property of Women, A History of Birth Control Politics in America. Urbana, University of Illinois Press, 2002. Moore, James C., Abortion in America, The Origins and Evolution of National Policy, 1800 to 1900. New York, Oxford University Press, 1978. Smith-Rosenberg, Carol. Disorderly Conduct, Visions of Gender in Victorian America. New York, Oxford University Press, 1985. Medical, Legal, and Cultural Context. American Medical Association. Transactions of the American Medical Association. Various volumes, mid-19th century. D'Amelio, John, and Estelle B. Friedman. Intimate Matters, A History of Sexuality in America. Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 2012. Reagan, Leslie J. When Abortion Was a Crime, Women, Medicine, and Law in the United States, 1867 to 1973. Berkeley, University of California Press, 1997. Methodological and Interpretive Works. Foucault, Michel. Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. New York, Vintage Books, 1995. Poovey, Mary. Uneven Developments, The Ideological Work of Gender in Mid-Victorian England. Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 1988. Note to the reader. This bibliography reflects what can be responsibly cited rather than everything that circulates about Madame Restell in popular retellings. Sources that rely on unattributed anecdotes, invented dialogue, or unsourced technical claims have been excluded.